There's something about hands that tells you who a person is. In the very first episode of the show, Days Gone By, Rick Grimes reaches for his sheriff's badge with steady fingers, pinning it to his uniform like it's a promise. The same gesture he's done 1,000 mornings before. Authority, service, protection, all of it contained in that small piece of metal. And then, 8 years later, in Season 9, Episode 5, What Comes After, Rick's hand reaches for a detonator on a bridge, and the determination is the same. But everything else has changed. The badge is long gone. The uniform is torn and bloodied, and Rick's not reaching for authority anymore, he's reaching for sacrifice. Same gesture, same man. Completely different person, and I keep wondering, when did Rick Grimes stop being a sheriff and become something else entirely? Was it gradual, a slow erosion over years of impossible choices? Or was there a moment, a single decision, where the old Rick died and someone new took his place? Tonight, let's trace not what Rick did, but who Rick became. Year by year, choice by choice, loss by loss, we'll follow the badge as it transforms from symbol of authority to burden too heavy to carry. Settle in. This is about transformation, sacrifice, and the cost of trying to save everyone. Rick wakes up in Season 1, Episode 1, and the world's ended while he was unconscious. The hospital's empty, bodies are everywhere, and nothing makes sense. And Rick's first instinct, his very first action after understanding what's happened, is to look for other people. He finds Morgan and Dwayne in a house, and Rick doesn't demand answers or take supplies and run. He sits down, he listens, he shares what little he knows. And when Morgan explains about the walkers, about the collapse, Rick's response is to offer help, to promise he'll come back with supplies, to maintain connection even in chaos. That's Season 1, Rick. A man who believes that civilization can be restored if people just work together, follow rules, maintain the structures that made society function. At the quarry camp outside Atlanta, Rick's leadership style is consultative, democratic. When Jim's bitten in Episode 4 and wants to be left behind to die, Rick doesn't make the call alone. He asks the group. He listens to objections. He tries to honor Jim's wishes while also keeping everyone safe. And Rick's speech to the group in those early episodes, it's about hope. He tells them they'll find the CDC, find answers, find safety. He genuinely believes that somewhere, someone in authority is still working to fix this, that the government hasn't fully collapsed. That rescue is possible, and when they reach the CDC in Episode 6, even though Dr. Jenner tells them there's no cure, no hope, Rick still tries to convince people to keep going. We don't kill the living isn't just a rule for Rick in Season 1. It's a moral absolute, a line that defines humanity versus monstrosity. The emotional anchor here is that Rick's idealism in Season 1 isn't naivety, it's hope. Rick's a sheriff, trained to protect and serve, and his worldview is built on the belief that society, laws, and morality are what separate humans from animals. And Rick's applying that worldview to the apocalypse, trying to create order from chaos, trying to maintain pre-outbreak ethics in a post-outbreak world, and it works, sort of. The group survives. They stay together. They trust Rick because Rick represents stability, the promise that they're still civilized people, not just survivors. But the cost of Rick's idealism is visible even in Season 1. People die. Jim dies, Amy dies, Ed dies. And each death, Rick takes personally. He couldn't save them. He couldn't protect them. And that failure, that inability to control outcomes despite his best efforts, it's the first crack in Rick's sheriff identity. Here's the question for you. If you woke up to the apocalypse tomorrow, would you try to maintain old world rules? Would you insist on democracy, on consultation, on giving everyone a voice even when quick decisions might save lives? Or would you recognize immediately that the old rules don't apply anymore, that survival requires different ethics? Because Rick, in Season 1, he's still living in the world that was. He's sheriffing a world that doesn't exist anymore, and the tension between who Rick was and who the apocalypse needs him to become, that's the foundation of his entire arc. Rick's idealism wasn't naivety. It was hope that would slowly, inevitably, kill the man he used to be. Season 2 is where Rick learns that leadership means making choices others will hate you for. Herschel's farm is supposed to be safety, a pause from the constant running. But Sophia goes missing in episode 1, and the search consumes weeks. And Rick's leading that search, organizing people, maintaining hope that Sophia's alive even as days turn into weeks. And Carl gets shot in episode 2, and Rick's faced with his son dying, and suddenly all the group's problems feel distant compared to that personal terror. Shane sacrifices Otis to save Carl, and Rick's grateful, doesn't question the story, doesn't see the moral cost. And when Carl survives, Rick thinks the group's intact, that they can keep going as they were. But then everything unravels. The barn massacre in episode 7 happens. Shane opens Herschel's barn and shoots all the walkers Herschel's been keeping. And Sophia stumbles out, the final walker, dead all along. And Rick has to shoot her. Rick has to kill Carol's daughter, end the hope they've been holding on to. And that moment, Rick standing there with his gun, Carol screaming, the group shattered. That's Rick, learning that hope can be a lie, that sometimes the kindest thing to do is end it. And Rick's exhaustion in season 2, you can see it in Andrew Lincoln's performance. Rick's barely sleeping, trying to mediate between Shane's aggression and Herschel's denial, trying to keep Lori happy, trying to be the leader everyone needs, and it's breaking him. The turning point is Shane. In episode 12, Better Angels, Rick kills Shane. We covered this in depth in another exploration, but what matters here is what it costs Rick. Shane's his best friend, his partner, the man who saved his family, and Rick stabs him, and Carl shoots Shane's reanimated corpse, and after that, Rick's different. In the season 2 finale, episode 13, Rick reveals Jenner's secret, everyone's infected, everyone turns when they die, and the group's angry he kept this from them. And Rick's response is the line that defines this chapter. This isn't a democracy anymore. Rick's done consulting. He's done asking for input. He's making decisions, and if people don't like it, they can leave. And that shift from democratic leadership to authoritarian control, it's Rick recognizing that keeping everyone alive requires making choices others won't thank him for. The emotional anchor is that Rick learns leadership means losing friends. Dale dies in episode 11, partly because Rick couldn't resolve the Randall situation fast enough. Shane dies in episode 12 by Rick's own hand. And the group that trusted Rick in season 1, they're afraid of him in season 2's finale. They follow him, yes, but it's not love anymore. It's obedience mixed with fear. And Rick's carrying that. He's lost Shane, lost Dale, lost Sophia indirectly, and Rick's accepted that being a leader means being alone. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes here, and we see it throughout the series, is that leaders lose friends as they gain authority, because hard choices alienate people. And Rick's making hard choices now. He's not the sheriff anymore, not really. The badge still hangs on his belt, but Rick's not serving the law, he's serving survival. And those aren't the same thing. Here's what I think. Rick stopped being a sheriff when he killed Shane. Everything before that, Rick was trying to apply pre-outbreak morality to post-outbreak reality. But killing Shane, choosing to murder his best friend to protect the group, that's the moment Rick crosses the line. That's when Rick becomes something harder, colder, more pragmatic. Shane wanted Rick to lead with brutality. And Rick killed Shane, then immediately became the leader Shane wanted him to be. The badge still hung on Rick's belt throughout season 2, but Rick wasn't wearing it anymore. Not really. He was just carrying the weight of what it used to mean, and learning that weight would only get heavier. Season 3 is Rick at his lowest and, paradoxically, his most effective. The prison becomes their home, fortified and cleared, and Rick's leadership is absolute. The group calls it Ricktatorship. Rick makes decisions, doesn't explain them, doesn't ask for input, and it works in terms of survival. The prison is secure, they have supplies, they're growing food. But Rick's falling apart internally. Lori dies giving birth to Judith in episode 4, Killer Within, and Rick's devastated. He goes into the prison tombs alone, massacring walkers in a grief-fueled rage, and then Rick starts hallucinating. He hears the phone ringing. He talks to Lori's ghost. He sees her standing in the prison yard, watching him, and Rick chases after her. The phone calls in episodes 5 and 6 are heartbreaking. Rick picks up a disconnected phone in the prison and hears voices. He thinks he's talking to survivors, to people from the quarry camp, to Lori. And he's not. There's no one on the other end. Rick's having a breakdown, manifesting his guilt and grief as auditory hallucinations, and the group doesn't know what to do. Herschel tries to support him. Daryl takes over some leadership decisions. But Rick's barely functional, making choices in a fog of grief, and the fact that the group survives is almost despite Rick's state, rather than because of his leadership. The Woodbury conflict with the governor escalates through Season 3, and Rick's forced to function even while breaking down. The governor attacks the prison, takes Glenn and Maggie hostage, threatens everything Rick's built, and Rick responds with violence, attacking Woodbury, rejecting the governor's peace offers, preparing for war. And Rick's absolutism, his refusal to compromise or negotiate, it's both strength and weakness. Rick's so focused on protecting his people that he can't see alternative paths. He's operating from trauma, from grief, from the belief that anyone outside his group is a threat. And that works in terms of survival but isolates Rick even from his own people. The emotional anchor is that leadership without support equals madness. Rick's making all the decisions, carrying all the burden, grieving alone, and he's literally going insane. The hallucinations aren't metaphorical. Rick's having a psychotic break, and yet the group still follows him, still trusts him, because Rick's kept them alive. That's the tragedy of Season 3. Rick's the most broken he's ever been and the most followed. The group needs Rick, even when Rick can barely hold himself together. And Rick's guilt about Lori, about Shane, about everyone they've lost, it's crushing him. He can't share it because leaders aren't supposed to show weakness. So Rick just carries it, and it nearly destroys him. The theory here is that Rick's grief over Lori and guilt over Shane made him unable to trust anyone, because trusting people means risking loss, and Rick's lost so much. Shane's death taught Rick that even best friends can become threats. Lori's death taught Rick that even survival doesn't guarantee you keep the people you love. So Rick isolates. He doesn't let anyone in. He makes unilateral decisions because consultation means vulnerability. And Rick can't afford vulnerability when he's barely holding it together. The dictatorship isn't just about control. It's about Rick's fear that if he shows weakness, if he admits he's breaking down, the group will fall apart. Here's the question. Could you lead while hallucinating your dead spouse? Could you make life and death decisions while grief is actively destroying your ability to think clearly? Because Rick did. And it worked, which is almost more disturbing than if it had failed. Rick kept the group alive despite being mentally unwell. And that suggests that maybe Season 3 Rick, broken and authoritarian, was what the apocalypse required. Maybe democracy and collaboration are luxuries you can't afford in constant crisis. Maybe effective leadership in the apocalypse means being willing to break yourself to keep others whole. And Rick, watching Lori's ghost disappear into the prison yard in episode 16, knowing she's not real but wishing desperately she was, he's learning that lesson. He's learning that leadership costs everything. Your sanity, your relationships, your sense of self, and you pay that cost anyway because people need you to. Rick was falling apart in Season 3, but he was holding everyone else together. And the question that haunts the rest of his arc is, how long can you do both before there's nothing left? Season 4 opens with Rick trying to be human again. He's given up his gun, metaphorically and literally handing leadership to the council. He's farming, teaching Carl about agriculture, trying to create normalcy. And you can see in the early episodes of Season 4 that Rick's healing. He's not hallucinating anymore. He's smiling. He's present with Judith, with Carl, with the group. He's trying to be the man he was before Shane, before Lori, before all the violence. And it's working, sort of. The prison's thriving. They've integrated Woodbury survivors. Herschel's influence, his gentle insistence that Rick deserves peace, it's given Rick permission to step back. And Rick's embracing that. He wants to be a father, a farmer, not a fighter. But the apocalypse won't let him. In episode 8, the governor returns and attacks the prison. Herschel's killed, brutally, in front of everyone. The prison falls. The group scatters. And Rick, bleeding and barely conscious, he's dragging Carl away from the wreckage, and all that peace, all that healing, it's gone. Rick tried to retire from violence. And violence found him anyway. By the mid-season premiere, Rick and Carl are on the road alone. And Rick's reverting to survival mode. He's assessing threats, rationing food, making hard calls. The farmer disappears. The sheriff survivor returns. And then comes episode 16, A, and the moment that defined season 4. Rick, Carl, and Michonne are captured by a group of men led by Joe, the claimer from earlier episodes. And Joe's group, they're planning to rape Carl and Michonne and kill Rick. And Rick, unarmed and held at gunpoint, he headbutts Joe, bites into his jugular, and tears Joe's throat out with his teeth. It's animalistic, horrifying, effective. Carl and Michonne survive because Rick became an animal. And after, when Rick's covered in blood, Carl's traumatized, and Michonne's silent, Rick says something like, "I'm okay. Are you okay?" And Carl just nods, and you can see he's terrified of his father. The emotional weight here is that Rick tried to be gentle, and the apocalypse punished him for it. Rick spent the first half of season 4 farming, and the governor destroyed the prison. Rick spent months being a father, and Joe's group threatened Carl. And the lesson Rick learns is, you can stop being a sheriff, but you can't stop being a survivor. You can put down the gun, but the violence will find you. And when it does, you have to be willing to become the thing that saves you, even if it's monstrous. Rick throat-ripping Joe isn't tactical, it's primal. It's Rick accessing something deep and brutal, because his child's life depends on it. And Rick becomes that, willingly, without hesitation. And that's the transformation. That's the moment Rick realizes he's not the man he was, can never be that man again. Because that man wouldn't have torn someone's throat out. But this man, season 4 Rick, he'll do whatever it takes. And there's no coming back from that. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that every time Rick tries to be gentle, violence pulls him back. Season 4's entire arc is Rick trying to escape his identity as a warrior and the world forcing him to embrace it. And by the season finale, Rick's accepted it. He's not fighting it anymore. He tells Daryl, "I'm not going to pretend I'm a farmer anymore." Rick's done trying to be something he's not. He's a survivor. He's a protector. And that means being willing to kill, brutally if necessary, to keep his people alive. The badge is still somewhere in Rick's belongings, probably. But it's irrelevant now. Rick's not serving law. He's not serving civilization. He's serving survival. And survival, as Rick's learning, requires becoming the thing you used to arrest, the thing you used to hunt. The predator, not the protector. Or maybe, Rick's realizing, in the apocalypse those are the same thing. Season 5 is Rick as predator. Terminus, the promised sanctuary, turns out to be a cannibal operation. And Rick, Daryl, Glenn, and Bob are nearly processed as meat. But Carol saves them, blowing up Terminus from outside, and Rick leads the group in massacring the remaining Terminus residents. And it's brutal. Rick's executing unarmed people, stabbing Gareth with a machete, and there's no hesitation, no remorse. These people tried to eat his family. They die. And Rick's efficiency, his coldness, it's shocking compared to season 1 Rick. This is a man who's decided that mercy is a luxury, and threats must be eliminated completely. The group reaches Alexandria in episode 11, and Rick's immediately suspicious. Alexandria's too clean, too safe, too naive. These people have walls and solar panels and a functioning community, and they haven't been hardened by the road, and Rick sees them as weak. There's a scene in episode 12 where Rick's talking to Carol and Daryl, and Rick says something to the effect of, "If they can't make it, we'll just take this place." Rick's not planning to integrate. He's planning to conquer if necessary. Alexandria thinks they're rescuing Rick's group. Rick knows he's assessing whether Alexandria's worth keeping or taking. And that shift, from grateful survivor to potential conqueror, it's Rick fully embracing his identity as the greater threat. In episode 15, Try, Rick confronts Pete, who's been abusing his wife Jessie. And Rick's not following Alexandria's rules, not going through Deanna's process. Rick just beats Pete half to death in the street. And when Deanna tells Rick he can't do this, Rick pulls his gun and gives a speech about how soft Alexandria is, how they don't understand survival, how they need to do things Rick's way. And Michonne knocks Rick out to stop him from shooting someone. And Rick's behavior, it's not rational leadership. It's a man who's been on the road so long, been so hard for so long, that he can't integrate into civilization anymore. Rick's become the thing Alexandria should fear, not the savior they need. The emotional anchor is that Rick's become the threat he used to arrest. Pre-outbreak, Rick would have arrested someone like Season 5 Rick. Violent, unpredictable, willing to kill without due process. Season 5, Rick is a vigilante at best, a warlord at worst. And the show doesn't condemn this entirely. Because Rick's right about some things. Alexandria is soft. They do need to be harder to survive. And Rick's methods, brutal as they are, they work. Pete's abusing Jesse, and Rick stops it. The wolves attack Alexandria, and Rick's group defends it. Rick's not wrong that his way keeps people alive, but Rick's also losing something essential. He's losing the part of himself that cared about being good, not just effective. The theory here is that Season 5 Rick no longer believes in redemption. He believes in elimination of threats. Shane wanted to kill Randall because Randall was a threat. Rick wanted a trial. But by Season 5, Rick is Shane. Rick executes Pete in the finale without trial, without process. Deanna gives permission, but Rick would have done it anyway. Rick's worldview has shifted from "we don't kill the living" to "we kill anyone who threatens us, immediately, without mercy." And that's effective. But it's also terrifying. Because once you've decided that elimination is always the answer, where do you stop? Who counts as a threat? And Rick, standing over Pete's body with a gun, he's become the sheriff again, but not in the way he was. He's judge, jury, and executioner. And Alexandria, watching Rick shoot an unarmed man, they're learning what it means to have Rick Grimes as your protector. It means you're safe. But it also means you're living with someone who's capable of anything. Here's the question. At what point does the protector become the predator? When you're willing to kill without hesitation, without remorse, to keep your people safe, are you still protecting them? Or are you just proving you're the biggest threat in the room? Rick's group survives Season 5 because Rick's willing to be brutal, but the cost is that Rick's terrifying. Even to people who love him, Rick's become someone you don't cross, don't question, don't challenge. And that power, that fear-based authority, it's effective, but lonely. And Rick, looking at the people of Alexandria, looking at him with fear, he knows it. He's kept everyone alive, and he's become the monster in their nightmares. And maybe, Rick's realizing, that's what survival requires. Season 6 is Rick losing control despite trying to control everything. The season opens with Rick discovering a massive walker horde trapped in a quarry near Alexandria. And Rick's solution is bold, aggressive, lead the horde away from Alexandria in a coordinated operation involving multiple communities. And Rick's leadership here is confident, almost arrogant. He's directing everyone, dismissing objections, convinced his plan will work. And it almost does, until the wolves attack Alexandria midway through the operation, and a horn sounds, and the horde turns back toward Alexandria. And Rick's plan, which was brilliant on paper, falls apart because he couldn't control every variable, and Alexandria is almost overrun. The horde breaches Alexandria's walls in Episode 8, and the community's filled with walkers. And Rick, he's trying to rally people, trying to organize defense, but it's chaos. People are dying. The walls have failed. And Rick's plan, his confident assertion that he could handle this, it's resulted in Alexandria's near destruction. And there's a moment in Episode 9, No Way Out, where Rick's fighting through walkers with Carl, and Carl gets shot. A stray bullet from an Alexandrian kid hits Carl in the face, and Carl collapses. And Rick, covered in walker blood, carrying his unconscious son, he's finally broken through. All of Rick's confidence, all of his aggressive leadership, and his son's been shot, and Rick can't fix it, can't control it, can't make it better with violence. He just has to wait, hope, pray that Carl survives. Carl does survive, but he loses his eye. And when Carl wakes up in Episode 10, there's a conversation between them. Carl says something to the effect of, "Dad, it's not your way." He's telling Rick that Rick's aggressive, controlling approach isn't working. That Rick's trying to force the world to bend to his will, and it's breaking things, hurting people. And Rick, looking at Carl's bandaged face, at the permanent injury his son suffered, he hears it. Rick realizes that his way aggressive pragmatism, total control, preemptive violence, it saved Alexandria from the horde, but it also created the conditions where Carl got shot, and Rick's forced to question everything. The emotional anchor is that Rick's own son is questioning his choices. Carl's not a child anymore. He's a teenager who survived everything Rick has, who's killed to protect the group, who understands the apocalypse. And Carl's telling Rick, your way is wrong. And that's devastating for Rick, because Rick's entire Season 5 and early Season 6 identity has been built on certainty. Rick knows what needs to be done. Rick makes the hard calls. Rick keeps everyone alive through sheer force of will and violence. But Carl's injury, Carl's words, they shatter that certainty. Rick saved Alexandria from walkers. But Rick's aggressive leadership created the chaos that got Carl shot. So which matters more, the survival or the cost? The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that children often see what parents can't. Carl's perspective, less hardened by leadership burden, more focused on human connection, it gives him clarity Rick lacks. Carl can see that Rick's becoming something dangerous, something that keeps people alive but also traumatizes them, isolates them, makes them afraid. And Carl's telling Rick, there has to be another way. You can't just control everything through violence. You can't protect people by terrifying them. And Rick, in Carl's hospital room, he's listening. Maybe for the first time in seasons, Rick's actually questioning whether his way is right. The theory here is that Rick realizes his way-aggressive pragmatism nearly killed everyone. Because Rick's plan for the Horde was tactically sound but didn't account for human error, for unexpected attacks, for chaos. Rick's been operating as if he can control everything, predict everything, manage all threats through superior planning and willingness to use violence. But the apocalypse is chaos. You can't control it. You can only respond to it. And Rick's attempt to control it, to force outcomes through aggression and confidence, it backfired. Alexandria was nearly destroyed. Carl was shot. And Rick's forced to accept that his certainty, his unwillingness to listen to objections or consider alternatives, it's a liability. Leadership isn't about control. It's about adaptation. And Rick's been so focused on controlling that he's forgotten to adapt. Here's what I think. Rick's leadership in Season 6 saved Alexandria and almost destroyed it. And the question becomes, which matters more? Because Rick's aggressive defense kept walkers out. But Rick's aggressive defense also created the conditions where Carl got hurt, where people died, where the community was traumatized. And there's no clean answer. Rick needed to be aggressive to handle the Horde. But Rick's aggression had costs. And Carl, lying in a hospital bed missing an eye, he's the physical manifestation of those costs. And Rick, looking at him, he can't escape that. He can't say, but we survived and make it okay. Because survival isn't just about being alive, it's about what you become to stay alive. And Rick's becoming something even his own son is afraid of. And that's the breaking point. That's where Rick starts to realize, maybe there's another way. Maybe leadership doesn't have to be control and violence. Maybe it can be something else. He just doesn't know what yet. Season 7 breaks Rick in a way nothing else has. In the premiere, The Day Will Come When You Won't Be, Negan kills Abraham and Glenn in front of Rick, Maggie, and the group. And Rick's on his knees, unable to stop it, unable to protect his people. Negan's bat comes down on Abraham's head, then Glenn's, and Rick watches. And after, Negan drags Rick into an RV and plays psychological games, forcing Rick to fetch his axe, threatening Carl, breaking Rick's spirit systematically. And when Rick and Negan return to the group, Rick's different. He's not the confident leader from Season 6. He's defeated. Negan's taken Rick's agency, his sense of control, everything Rick's built his identity on. And Rick submits. He agrees to give Negan half of everything Alexandria has. He tells the group they're working for Negan now. The evidence that this is defeat, not strategy, is in Rick's face throughout early Season 7. Andrew Lincoln's performance shows a man who's broken. Rick's not pretending to submit while planning rebellion. He's genuinely defeated. When Michonne finds a gun in Episode 4 and wants to fight, Rick tells her, no, they can't win. They have to live with this. When Spencer tries to undermine Rick and get Negan to make him leader, Rick's not angry. He's just tired. Rick's learned that he's not invincible, that there are threats he can't defeat through violence or planning or willpower. And that knowledge, that he can fail, that he can lose people he loves and be powerless to stop it, it destroys Rick's sense of self. Because Rick's identity has been protector. And Negan proved Rick can't always protect. The turning point comes mid-season, when Rick learns Alexandria isn't alone. The kingdom exists, led by Ezekiel. Hilltop exists, led by Gregory, then Maggie. Oceanside exists, hidden and armed. And Rick realizes, Negan's strong, but he's not invincible. If the communities unite, they can fight. And Rick's hope returns, not as naive optimism, but as strategic possibility. Rick starts recruiting allies, planning attacks, preparing for war. And by the season finale, Rick's leading a coalition against the Saviors. Rick's agency is restored. He's not on his knees anymore. He's standing, fighting, leading. And that restoration, that return from defeated victim to active warrior, it's what saves Rick psychologically. Because Rick can't exist without purpose, and his purpose has always been protecting his people through action. And Negan took that away, temporarily. But Rick found it again. The emotional weight is that Negan broke Rick in ways walkers never could. Because walkers are mindless. You can kill them, plan for them, defend against them, but Negan's human, intelligent, sadistic. He doesn't just threaten Rick's people. He threatens Rick's sense of self. By forcing Rick to submit, by taking Rick's agency, Negan attacks the core of who Rick is. And Rick, on his knees watching Glenn die, he's not just losing a friend. He's losing the belief that he can protect people. That leadership means something. That his choices matter. And that loss, that destruction of Rick's identity, it's worse than any physical injury. Because Rick survived everything through the belief that he can act, can make choices, can affect outcomes. And Negan proved that's not always true. Sometimes you're powerless. Sometimes you lose. Sometimes you can't save people no matter how strong or smart or determined you are. The theory is that Negan broke Rick by taking his agency, and Rick only recovered by finding it again through rebellion. Because Rick can't be a passenger. He can't follow someone else's orders, accept someone else's authority, live in someone else's system. Rick needs to be active, making choices, even if they're terrible choices. And Negan's control, that forced submission, it was killing Rick slowly, not physically, but psychologically. Rick was disappearing, becoming a shell. And Rick's decision to fight, even when it's dangerous, even when it might get more people killed, it's Rick choosing to exist again. Choosing to be Rick Grimes, leader and protector, rather than Rick Grimes, Negan's servant. And that choice, that rebellion, it's survival. Not physical survival, psychological survival. Because Rick learned he wasn't invincible, but he still had people worth fighting for. And that, somehow, was enough to keep going. Season 8 is all-out war, and Rick's leading it with brutality that mirrors Shane's philosophy completely. The Savior's outposts are attacked. The sanctuary is besieged. Rick's coalition, Alexandria, Hilltop, the Kingdom, Oceanside, they're united in violence against Negan, and Rick's tactics are ruthless. In Episode 4, Rick and Daryl have a plan to redirect walkers into the sanctuary, essentially condemning the workers inside non-combatants to death by horde. Daryl does it despite Rick's last-minute hesitation, and Rick's okay with it. He accepts the civilian casualties as necessary. That's not Sheriff Rick. That's not even Season 5 Rick. That's Rick fully embracing total war, where the ends justify any means. But then Carl gets bitten. In Episode 8, the mid-season finale, Rick and the group discover that Carl's been bitten while helping Sadiq, a stranger. Carl's going to die. And Carl's written letters to everyone before succumbing. Letters asking them to stop the war, to make peace, to find another way. Carl writes to Negan directly, telling him he can change, that it's not too late, that violence doesn't have to define him. And Carl writes to Rick, begging his father to end the war, to honor Carl's vision of peace, to become better than what the apocalypse has made him. And Carl dies in Episode 9, Honor, surrounded by family in the sewers beneath Alexandria, and Rick's world shatters. The emotional anchor is that Carl dies begging Rick to stop. Carl's final wish, his dying request, is for Rick to end the war and make peace. And Rick, grieving, he continues the war anyway. Through Episodes 10 through 15, Rick's still fighting, still planning attacks, still trying to kill Negan. Rick's justification is that he's too deep in, that stopping now would make Carl's death meaningless, that Negan has to die for the war to end. But Carl's letters are asking for the opposite. Carl's asking Rick to prove that peace is possible, that mercy isn't weakness, that there's another way. And Rick ignores it. Rick buries his son and keeps killing. And that choice, to continue the war despite Carl's dying wish, it shows how far Rick's fallen into violence, how completely Rick's become the thing Carl was begging him not to be. In the finale, episode 16, Wrath, Rick finally listens. Rick slits Negan's throat, but not deep enough to kill. Rick saves Negan's life, then announces Negan will be imprisoned, alive, as proof that Carl's vision of peace is possible, and it's controversial. Maggie's furious Negan killed Glenn, and Rick's sparing him. Daryl's angry. Oceanside wanted Negan dead, but Rick chooses mercy, publicly, decisively. And that choice, made at the last possible moment, it's Rick finally honoring Carl's letters, finally choosing hope over vengeance, finally becoming the person Carl asked him to be instead of the person the war made him. But it's too late. Carl's already dead, and Rick's choice to spare Negan can't bring Carl back. It's just the only way Rick knows to honor him. The theory is that Rick became the thing Carl died asking him not to be, then changed only after Carl was gone. Because Rick heard Carl's letters in episode 9. Rick knew what Carl wanted. But Rick didn't stop. Rick kept fighting, kept killing, kept trying to win through violence. And only when Rick's won, when Negan's defeated, and the war's over, does Rick choose mercy. And that timing, that Rick only changes after Carl's death can't be prevented, it's tragic. Because Carl might have lived if Rick had stopped earlier. Maybe if Rick had pursued peace instead of war, Carl wouldn't have been in Alexandria when it fell, wouldn't have been helping Sadiq in those woods, wouldn't have been bitten. We can't know. But the possibility haunts Rick. And Rick's decision to spare Negan, it's not just about honoring Carl's wish. It's about Rick trying to prove that Carl's death wasn't meaningless, that Carl's vision of peace was worth dying for. And Rick carries that guilt, that question of whether he could have saved Carl by choosing differently for the rest of his arc. The pattern is that children in The Walking Dead die trying to save their parents' souls. Carl dies asking Rick to be better, and Rick becomes better, but only after Carl's gone. And that's the cruelty of it. The lesson comes too late. The change happens after the loss. And Rick, sparing Negan, looking at Maggie's anger and understanding it, he knows he won the war and lost his son. And the question that defines the rest of Rick's story is, was it worth it? Did the war accomplish anything that justifies Carl's death? And Rick, I think, doesn't have an answer. He just has Carl's letters and the hope that honoring them means Carl's death wasn't for nothing. Even though he knows, deep down, that it probably was. Season 9's first 5 episodes are Rick trying to unite the communities and failing, then sacrificing himself to save them all. Rick's vision, inspired by Carl's letters, is that Alexandria, Hilltop, the Kingdom, and Oceanside will work together, rebuild, create something better than just survival. And Rick's building a bridge, literally, connecting communities, symbolizing unity. But the communities are fractured. Maggie's leading Hilltop and she's furious about Negan's imprisonment. Daryl's leading Sanctuary reluctantly and it's falling apart. The Kingdom's struggling. And Rick's trying to hold it all together through sheer force of will, through belief that Carl's vision is possible. And Rick's exhausted. You can see it in Andrew Lincoln's performance. Rick's not sleeping, barely eating, running between communities trying to mediate conflicts, and he's operating on hope and grief. In episode 5, What Comes After, Rick's final episode, everything falls apart and comes together simultaneously. Rick's thrown from his horse, impaled on rebar, badly injured. And a walker horde is approaching the communities. And Rick, bleeding out, he leads the horde away toward the bridge the communities built together. And Rick makes it to the bridge, turns to face the horde, and he blows up the bridge with dynamite, destroying the walkers and himself. Except Rick doesn't die. He's thrown clear by the explosion, and a CRM helicopter piloted by Anne picks him up, saving Rick but taking him away from everything he loves. The theory is that Rick's bridge sacrifice is atonement for years of violence. Because Rick spent seasons making brutal choices, killing threats, operating from fear and aggression. And Carl's letters asked him to stop, to choose peace, to build instead of destroy. And Rick's trying. But it's hard. Rick doesn't know how to lead peacefully. He only knows how to lead through strength. And the bridge, the community's unified project, it's Rick's attempt to create something instead of just protecting or killing. And when Rick blows it up to save those communities, when Rick destroys the symbol of unity to protect the people, it's Rick choosing sacrifice. Rick's giving everything: his blood, his future, his connection to family to save others. And that's the sheriff. That's the protector. But it's also the warrior, the survivor, the man who's learned that sometimes saving people means giving up yourself. The emotional weight is that Rick finally becomes who Carl asked him to be, and it costs him everything. Rick chooses peace in episode 16 of season 8 by sparing Negan. Rick chooses unity in season 9 by building the bridge. And Rick chooses sacrifice in episode 5 by destroying the bridge to save the communities. Rick's listening to Carl, honoring Carl's vision, becoming the leader Carl believed Rick could be. But the cost is Rick's separation from his family. Rick doesn't die, but he might as well have. From Judith and Michonne's perspective, they think he's dead. And Rick's taken to CRM, held prisoner for years. And Rick's trying to escape, trying to get back to his family, but he can't. And Rick's greatest fear, the thing that's driven him since season 1, is failing to protect his family. And by protecting everyone else, by sacrificing himself for the communities, Rick loses access to his own family. And that's the cruelest cost imaginable. Here's the question. Is redemption through death the only option left? Because Rick's arc from season 1 to season 9 is a man becoming increasingly brutal, making harder choices, losing pieces of himself. And Carl's death forces Rick to confront that trajectory, to ask if violence is the only answer. And Rick decides it's not. Rick chooses peace, unity, sacrifice. But the cost of that redemption is losing everything. Rick saves the communities and loses his family. And the show's asking, was that necessary? Could Rick have redeemed himself without sacrificing himself? Or was Rick so far gone, so defined by violence and control, that the only way to prove he'd changed was to give up everything? And I think the show leaves it open. Some fans see Rick's bridge sacrifice as heroic, the perfect end to his arc. Others see it as tragic, Rick unable to escape the cycle of violence even when trying to. And both are valid. Rick's bridge sacrifice is heroic and tragic, redemptive and heartbreaking. The moment Rick becomes the hero Carl believed he could be, and the moment Rick loses everything that made being a hero worthwhile. The badge, if Rick still had it, it fell into the river with him. The sheriff, finally, drowned. And what emerged, what Anne pulled from that river, was just a man trying to get home. The Ones Who Live miniseries shows us where Rick's been, with the CRM, the Civic Republic military, for years after the bridge. Rick's a soldier in their army, given a prosthetic hand to replace the one he lost, assigned missions, trapped in a system he can't escape. And Rick's tried to escape, multiple times. The scars on his body, the resignation in his face, they tell the story of someone who's fought and lost repeatedly. And Rick's given up, sort of. He's written letters to Michonne that he'll never send, drawn pictures of Judith he'll never show her, and he's accepted that he's never getting home. That the CRM's too powerful, too organized, too controlling, and Rick's just existing, surviving, but not living. And then Michonne appears. She's tracked Rick somehow, found him after years of searching. And when Rick sees her, when he realizes Michonne's real and not a hallucination, everything changes. Because Rick's purpose has always been protecting his family. And without them, Rick's been empty, going through motions, following orders, surviving but without meaning. And Michonne's presence restores that meaning. Rick's not trapped anymore. He's got someone to protect, someone to escape with, someone worth risking everything for. And Rick and Michonne's escape from the CRM, their fight to get home to Judith and RJ, it's Rick, finally, after years of being powerless, reclaiming his agency. The theory here is that Rick's separation from his family was his worst torture, worse than any Walker, any Negan, any governor. Because Rick's identity, his entire sense of self, it's built on being a protector, a father, a husband. And the CRM took that away. They didn't kill Rick, but they might as well have. They killed who Rick is, by separating him from the people who make him Rick. And Rick, in those years with the CRM, he's a ghost. He looks like Rick, survives like Rick, but there's nothing behind his eyes. He's lost without his family. And only when Michonne finds him, only when Rick's got someone to protect again, does Rick become Rick again. The emotional anchor is Rick's desperation when Michonne appears. You can see in Andrew Lincoln's performance that Rick's been holding on by a thread, and Michonne's the lifeline. Rick's been surviving without purpose, and Michonne gives him purpose again. Not just escaping, but escaping together, protecting her, getting home to their children. And that purpose, that love, it's what Rick's needed all along. Rick can't exist in a vacuum. He needs people to protect, people to love, people to make his survival meaningful. And the CRM, by separating Rick from his family, they didn't punish him with hardship. They punished him with meaninglessness. They made Rick survive without reason. And for Rick, that's worse than death. The pattern here is that Rick's identity has always been protector of family. When he wakes in Season 1, his first mission is finding Lori and Carl. Every brutal choice in Seasons 2 to 8, it's about protecting his people. The bridge sacrifice in Season 9, it's about protecting the communities his family is part of. And the CRM years, they're Rick being unable to protect anyone he loves. And that inability, that forced separation, it breaks Rick more than any physical torture could. Because Rick's not afraid of pain. He's afraid of failing the people he loves. And by keeping him from them, the CRM makes Rick live in constant failure. Constant awareness that he's not there, not protecting Judith and RJ, not supporting Michonne. And that guilt, that helplessness, it's Rick's personal hell. And only Michonne's arrival, only the chance to protect her and escape together, gives Rick hope again. Gives Rick himself again. And when Rick and Michonne finally make it home, finally see Judith and RJ, Rick's not a CRM soldier anymore. He's not a sheriff or a warrior or a survivor. He's just dad. And maybe that's all he ever wanted to be. Alexandria continues without Rick. And in some ways, it thrives. Seasons 9 through 11. After Rick's departure, the communities face the Whisperers, the Commonwealth, new threats and new alliances. And they survive. They adapt. They grow. Judith grows up, carries Rick's gun, wears his hat, and becomes a leader in her own right. RJ, Rick's son he never met, grows up hearing stories about his father but not knowing him. And the communities, Alexandria and Hilltop and the Kingdom, they follow principles Rick established. Protect each other, work together, choose peace when possible, but fight when necessary. Rick's leadership legacy lives in the choices his people make after he's gone. The theory is that Rick's legacy isn't his violence. It's the community that survived his absence. Because Rick could have built a community dependent on him, one that collapsed when he left. But Rick, especially in Season 9, he built structures, councils, systems that didn't require him personally. Rick empowered Michonne, Daryl, Maggie, Carol, others to lead. Rick created redundancy, multiple strong leaders, so no single loss would destroy everything. And when Rick sacrificed himself on the bridge, when Rick was removed from the story, the communities kept going. They grieved him. They missed him. But they didn't collapse. And that, I think, is Rick's greatest achievement. Not that he kept people alive personally, but that he built something strong enough to survive without him. The evidence is in Judith. She carries Rick's Colt Python revolver, the gun Rick carried from Season 1. She wears his hat occasionally, connecting her to Rick and Carl both. And Judith's growing up to be brave, compassionate, willing to help strangers, willing to fight for her people. She's everything Rick was. At his best, protective without being controlling, strong without being cruel, hopeful without being naive. Judith never knew Rick. She was a baby when he left. But Judith embodies Rick's values, because the community Rick built passed those values down. Michonne taught her. Daryl taught her. Carol taught her. And Judith's not just Rick's daughter biologically. She's Rick's daughter philosophically, inheriting his mission of protecting people and building community. RJ carries Rick's name, Rick Grimes Jr., but doesn't carry his burden. RJ's growing up in a world slightly safer than the one Rick navigated. And that safety, that relative peace, it's Rick's gift. RJ doesn't have to be a warrior at age 8 like Carl did. RJ can be a kid, relatively speaking, because Rick and others fought to create a world where childhood's possible. And RJ's existence, Rick's son growing up without knowing his father, it's bittersweet. Rick saved the world for his son but lost the chance to be in it with him. And RJ, hearing stories about Rick from Michonne and Judith, he knows his father as legend, not as person. And that distance, that separation, it's the cost of Rick's heroism. The emotional anchor is that Rick's children never really knew him but live his values. Carl knew Rick but died before seeing Rick become who Carl asked him to be. Judith was too young to remember Rick but carries his mission. RJ never met Rick but bears his name. And all three, in different ways, they're Rick's legacy. Not the violence Rick committed, not the brutal choices, but the love Rick had for them, the world Rick tried to build for them, the values Rick hoped they'd carry forward. And the communities, watching Judith help strangers and RJ grow up safe, they see Rick in these children. They see proof that Rick's sacrifices meant something. That Rick's years of violence and leadership and loss, they created something worth having. A future where Rick's children can live, even if Rick can't be there to see it. Here's what I think. Rick's greatest achievement was building something that didn't need him. Because the selfish leader, the controlling leader, they make themselves indispensable. They create systems where only they can lead, only they can decide, only they can protect. And when they die or leave, everything collapses. But Rick, despite his dictatorial Season 3, despite his controlling Season 6, he ultimately built distributed leadership. He empowered others. He created a community strong enough to survive without him. And that's love. That's true protection. Not making yourself the only one who can save people, but creating a world where people can save themselves. And Rick, taken by the CRM, separated from his family, he has to live with the knowledge that his people are okay without him. And that's comforting and devastating. Comforting because Rick's life's work succeeded. Devastating because Rick's not there to see it. Because the community Rick built doesn't need Rick Grimes anymore. They just need his legacy. And that legacy, carried by his children and his people, it's alive and thriving. Even while Rick's absent. Rick lost almost everything that mattered. Season by season, person by person, Rick's personal life was destroyed by his public role. Lori dies in Season 3, childbirth, complicated by the apocalypse and the stress Rick's leadership put on her. Carl dies in Season 8, bitten while helping a stranger, a direct result of the values Rick taught him. Help people, and the war Rick was waging, chaos that created vulnerability. Judith grows up without Rick. RJ never meets him. Michonne separated from him for years, and Shane, Dale, Herschel, Glenn, Abraham, friends, mentors, family, all dead. Most directly or indirectly because of choices Rick made, situations Rick led them into, conflicts Rick couldn't resolve peacefully. The theory here is that leadership in The Walking Dead equals sacrificing personal happiness for collective survival. Because Rick's brutal choices, his leadership decisions, they kept hundreds of people alive. Alexandria survived. Hilltop survived. The Kingdom survived. Communities thrived because Rick was willing to do the ugly work, make the hard calls, be the person who'd kill when necessary. But the cost was Rick's personal life. Every season, Rick lost someone he loved. And Rick kept going, kept leading, kept protecting strangers and allies while his personal circle shrank. And by Season 9, Rick's lost almost everyone he started with. His family's reduced to Judith, who doesn't know him, Michonne, who he loves but is separated from, and RJ, who doesn't exist yet from Rick's perspective when he's taken. Rick saved communities and lost his family doing it. The evidence is in the pattern. Season 2, Rick loses Shane. Season 3, Rick loses Lori. Season 4, Rick loses Herschel. Season 5, Rick loses Beth, indirectly. Season 6, Rick loses multiple Alexandrians. Season 7. Rick loses Glenn and Abraham. Season 8. Rick loses Carl. Season 9. Rick loses access to everyone when the CRM takes him. Every season, Rick's world shrinks, even as his responsibilities grow. And Rick carries the guilt of every loss. He wonders if he could have saved Shane by being a different kind of leader. He wonders if Lori would have survived if he'd been less consumed by leadership. He wonders if Carl would have lived if Rick had chosen peace earlier. And Rick doesn't have answers. He just has grief, stacked year upon year, loss upon loss. And Rick keeps leading anyway because people need him to. Because if Rick stops, if Rick gives up, then everyone he's lost, they died for nothing. The emotional weight is that Rick saved hundreds, but couldn't save the people closest to him. And there's a cruelty to that. Rick's a protector by nature. His entire identity is keeping people safe. And the people Rick loves most, his family, they're the ones he fails to protect. Lori dies despite Rick's best efforts. Carl dies despite Rick's attempts to create safety. And Rick's taken from Judith and RJ, unable to protect them at all. And Rick, carrying that failure, it's crushing. Because what's the point of saving strangers if you can't save your family? What's the point of leadership if it costs you everyone you love? And Rick doesn't have an answer. He just keeps trying, keeps hoping that maybe the next person he saves will balance out the losses. That maybe if he saves enough people, the guilt of losing his family will ease. And it doesn't. It never does. Rick just learns to carry it. The counter theory, and it's important, is that maybe those deaths enabled Rick to save others. Carl's letters led Rick to spare Negan, which ended the war, which saved countless lives. Lori's death forged Rick into someone harder, capable of making choices that kept the group alive through Season 3's conflicts. Shane's death taught Rick that leadership requires brutal choices. Every loss, horrific as it was, shaped Rick into someone who could protect communities. And maybe, just maybe, Rick couldn't have saved Alexandria, Hilltop, hundreds of people, if he'd been less hardened by personal loss. Maybe the grief made Rick capable of the ruthlessness survival required. And that's even crueler, in a way. Because it suggests Rick's personal losses weren't just tragic coincidences. They were necessary sacrifices for Rick to become the leader the apocalypse demanded. And Rick, if he believed that, it wouldn't make the losses hurt less. It would just add another layer of guilt, the knowledge that his family died so others could live. And Rick would have to decide if that's acceptable. If collective survival justifies personal devastation. Here's the question for you. Is leadership worth losing everyone you lead for? Because Rick made that trade. Rick gained authority, saved communities, built a legacy. And Rick lost his wife, his son, years with his remaining children, his connection to everyone he loved. And by the end, Rick's surrounded by people he's saved and hollowed out by the people he's lost. And I don't think Rick would say it was worth it. I think Rick would give up everything. Alexandria, his legacy, all of it, to have Carl back, to have been there for Judith and RJ, to have lived quietly with Michonne. But Rick didn't get that choice. The apocalypse didn't offer a path where Rick keeps his family and saves communities. It demanded both. And Rick, protector to his core, he chose saving others. And the cost was everything. And Rick keeps everyone alive, except the people who made living worthwhile. Who did Rick Grimes become? After 9 seasons, after years with the CRM, after losing and finding and losing again, who is Rick at the end of his journey? And I think the answer is, Rick never stopped being a sheriff. He just learned that sheriffs can't save everyone, and sometimes protecting people means sacrificing yourself. Rick's arc from Season 1 to The Ones Who Live is a man trying to serve and protect in a world that punishes service and protection. And Rick kept trying anyway. The badge is gone. The uniform is gone. The laws Rick once enforced are gone. But the mission, the core identity of I protect people, that never left Rick. It just evolved, darkened, became more costly and more necessary. Rick's progression. Sheriff, survivor, leader, warrior, sacrifice, prisoner, father, returning home. And each phase, Rick's learning something painful. Sheriff Rick learns civilizations collapsed. Survivor Rick learns violence is necessary. Leader Rick learns decisions alienate people. Warrior Rick learns brutality has costs. Sacrifice, Rick learns protection requires giving yourself up. Prisoner Rick learns powerlessness. And Father Rick, returning home in the ones who live, he learns that love, not duty, is what matters. That coming home to Judith and RJ and Michonne, that's the mission. Not protecting strangers, not saving communities, just being there for the people who love you. And Rick's entire arc has been moving toward that realization, slowly, painfully, through a decade of loss. The theory is that Rick never stopped being a sheriff. He just learned sheriffs can't save everyone, because Season 1, Rick believed in protection as an absolute. If he was strong enough, smart enough, fast enough, he could keep everyone safe. And reality brutally taught Rick otherwise. People die despite Rick's best efforts. People Rick loves, people Rick's responsible for, they die. And Rick can't control it, can't prevent it, can't even always understand why. And Rick's arc is accepting that limitation while refusing to stop trying. Rick learns he can't save everyone, but Rick keeps trying to save someone, anyone. And that persistence, that refusal to give up despite constant loss, that's the sheriff. That's the mission. Serve and protect, even when it's futile. Even when it costs everything. Even when you know you'll fail more than you succeed. The evidence is in Rick's final words, his letters, his messages to Carl, Michonne, Judith. They're all about protecting, serving, leading. Rick's vocabulary hasn't changed. His mission hasn't changed. Rick's still the man from Season 1 who wanted to save people. He's just learned how much that mission costs. And Rick's paid that cost. Over and over. And Rick's still here. Still trying. Still carrying the weight of everyone he couldn't save and everyone he did. And that's the tragedy and the triumph of Rick Grimes. He became someone he wouldn't have recognized in Season 1. Someone brutal, ruthless, willing to kill without hesitation. But Rick also stayed someone recognizable. Someone who puts others first, who sacrifices for strangers, who believes people are worth saving even when they prove they're not. Rick's both the sheriff from Season 1 and the throat-ripping warrior from Season 4. Both the idealist and the pragmatist. Both the protector and the predator. And holding both identities, that contradiction, it's destroyed Rick, piece by piece. And it's also what makes Rick heroic. The pattern The Walking Dead establishes is that protagonists don't win. They just survive long enough to understand the cost. And Rick survived longer than almost anyone. And Rick understands the cost. He's paid it in blood, in grief, in years away from his family. And when Rick finally makes it home, when Michonne brings him back, and Judith and RJ meet or re-meet their father, Rick's not triumphant. He's just grateful. Grateful to be alive, to see his children, to hold Michonne. The wars don't matter anymore. The communities don't matter. The legacy doesn't matter. What matters is Rick's home. And that realization, that all the violence and sacrifice and leadership, it was never the point. The point was always coming home. That's what makes Rick's arc complete. Not that he became a great leader, but that he learned what actually matters and fought his way back to it. Here's the final question. Is Rick's arc tragedy or triumph? Because Rick lost almost everything, becoming who he became. But Rick also saved countless lives, built communities, raised children who embody his values. Rick's journey destroyed him and forged him, made him a monster and a hero, took his family and gave him a legacy. And I don't think there's a clean answer. Rick's story is both. It's a tragedy because of what Rick lost. It's a triumph because of what Rick built. And Rick, carrying both, he's the embodiment of The Walking Dead's central theme. Survival requires sacrifices that change you. And eventually you have to decide if the person you've become was worth the person you used to be. And Rick, looking at Judith and RJ holding Michonne, I think he's decided, yes. The cost was unbearable, but coming home made it bearable. The badge is gone, but Rick still carries what it meant. The burden of protecting others, the mission of serving even when it's thankless. The identity of someone who'll sacrifice himself before letting others suffer. That's Rick Grimes, sheriff, survivor, father, broken and whole, lost and found, home.